What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Vice President of Reasons to Believe, Kenneth Samples, and his take on genocide and slavery in the Bible. Zach from Adherent Apologetics recently sat down with him to discuss a number of issues. There are a lot of things that are said in this particular section that needs to be addressed, like the fact that he thinks that pagan children should die so that they don't grow up as pagans. Yikes! If you want to fuck around and find out why Kenneth Samples thinks that genocide and slavery is a good thing, then please stay tuned.
But looking at like the goodness of Christianity, there's a lot of objections here, and one of the big ones is like Old Testament genocide. The question of like, is God commanding genocide? Like in my own like Bible reading this morning, I was in Deuteronomy 2 where it talks about and they devoted everything to the Lord and all the destruction and whatnot. So like, how do you approach like Old Testament and the supposed genocides going on here?
Why, yes, Zach, I would agree that this is a big objection that I have to the Old Testament. I don't understand how anybody can reconcile biblical genocide with the idea that God is good all the time. It seems to me that God could figure out a solution that doesn't include the needless slaughter of innocent lives.
Yeah, I think, and I think you're exactly right. I think the question of Joshua's conquest of the Canaanites is probably right at the top of the list, where people say, wow, in the New Testament, you have Jesus. He is gracious, he's kind, he's loving. But then you have this Old Testament God, Yahweh or Jehovah, and he seems to be bloodthirsty. He seems to be wrathful.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. The OT God seems to be a bit of a bastard, doesn't he? It's almost like you have two totally different gods when comparing the Old Testament God to the New Testament God. The New Testament does have its issues as well, but the Old Testament God is definitely not a good God.
Well, I think there's a number of things that we can say. One of the points I like to begin with is that the Canaanites were a reprobate nation. They were involved in actions that were deeply immoral. For example, they had, as part of their religion, child sacrifice. They had sexual relations with animals. This was in many ways kind of a perverted and wicked religion. Now, God doesn't destroy them immediately. For 400 years, the prophets are preaching to the pagan nations, telling them there is a creator. He has a moral standard. You have been made in God's image. You need to move away from this.
Oh, man. One of my favorite stories from the Old Testament is the story of Jephthah. You see, in Judges 11, Jephthah was a commander of the Israelite army. He was about to go out there and whoop some Ammonite ass, but then he makes a promise to God. He promises that if God helps him defeat the Ammonites, then he will sacrifice the first thing that runs out from his house to greet him when he gets home. I don't know why in the fuck that was the first thing on his mind. Anyways, so Jephthah cleans house with the Ammonites. I mean, he's basically like a Hebrew John Wick. When he comes home, his daughter is the first thing to run out of his house and greet him. So obviously, Jephthah had to sacrifice his daughter. His daughter even encourages him to do it. She just asked for a stay of execution of about a month so that she could frolic in the fields. Now, here's where I am at on this story in the context of God doesn't like child sacrifices. God knew that Jephthah's daughter was going to be the first thing to run out of his house when he made the deal with Jephthah. God knew this and still made the deal with Jephthah. If God really hated child sacrifice all that much, he would have not made that deal with Jephthah. The nearest that I can tell is that God is just really pissed off that these child sacrifices weren't being made to him, which essentially makes it him being pissed off about people worshiping other gods.
And yet they reject it. And so God commands Joshua to destroy the Canaanite religion?
No, that is not what God commanded of Joshua. God commanded that Joshua destroy the entire group of people. He even meticulously lists out everything that is supposed to die. They devoted the city to the Lord and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua 6:21. Painting it as destroying their religion is a really odd way to describe the genocide of an entire people group. If it's just the religion that God wanted to be wiped out, then there are plenty of ways for him to accomplish that doesn't include genocide. For instance, when God wanted to destroy the religion of Baal, he had Elijah massacre all the prophets of Baal. Then Elijah said, "Capture the prophets of Baal. Don't let any of them run away." The people captured all the prophets. Then Elijah led them down to the Kishon Valley, where he killed them. 1 Kings 18:40. Mind you, this was after a brief pissing contest between Baal and God. My point is that if God was really just targeting the religion, then he wouldn't have called for all the men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys to be slaughtered.
Now, Christians take two differing positions here. Some people think that scripture indicates that the goal of Joshua was not to destroy all of the Canaanite people, men, women, and children. Rather, it was to displace the people and to destroy the religion. And so somebody like Paul Copan, who is a Christian friend, an ethicist, a philosopher, he holds the displacement view, meaning that he believes that the language of destruction, annihilate every man, woman, and child, drag the ground, that this was hyperbole. It was kind of warfare hyperbole that was very common for the time. That in reality, women and children were not targeted by the armies of Israel. And therefore, the Canaanite religion was displaced.
Whew, okay, so this is the same mindfuck that we just saw J-Dubs in our recent video about genocide regurgitate. This just makes it seem like he's painfully twisting words in order to soften the blow of the call for the slaughter of innocent people. As we saw earlier with the Canaanites, God directly calls for the slaughter of women and children. If you're issuing orders to an invading force, why would you speak figuratively? Joshua was a military leader, so his words needed to be exact in order to direct his armies to do what he wanted. If Joshua didn't want women and children killed, then he wouldn't have specifically said to kill the women and children. But let's work with this hypothesis that God didn't really want the women and children to be killed. Then I'm kind of curious, how do you explain these verses? They fought the Midianites as the Lord commanded Moses, and they killed every Midianite man. He asked them, "Why did you let the women live?" They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and turned the Israelites from the Lord at Peor. Then a terrible sickness struck the Lord's people. Kill all the Midianite boys, and kill all the Midianite women who have had sexual relations. But save for yourselves the girls who have not had sexual relations with a man. Numbers 31:7, 15 to 18. So, starting from the beginning of that encounter, we have the Israelites not targeting the Midianite women and children. So far so good with this hypothesis that God didn't want them to be killed. But then Moses gets really pissed off because they didn't follow God's commands, and then subsequently called for the extermination of everybody with the exception of the young, virgin, prepubescent girls. Under the idea that God was not meaning to target the women and children, it seems really weird for God to issue commands where he specifically targets women and children.
And there is some evidence for that. It appears that some of the people that were the target of it, nevertheless, were not destroyed.
Okay, genocide does not require the total annihilation of a people group. The group could be destroyed in part or in whole. What matters is that the intent of the Israelites, or the intent of God, was to wipe the Canaanites off the face of the earth. That is all that matters. The fact that some people survived this genocide does not indicate that the Israelites were not targeting women and children. However, it would be evidence of the attempted genocide to include women and children.
Now, Zach, other scholars differ. Excuse me. Other scholars think, for example, that God brought forth a judgment upon the Canaanites. And that would be the idea that God, in fact, did destroy through the Israelite armies, Joshua in particular, and that he killed men, women, and children. Now, the idea there is that God is different than human beings. God gives life, therefore God can take it. The idea would be that even if children were targeted, in some respects, it would be a mercy because those children would have grown up in paganism. They would have suffered ultimately the wrath of God by being killed. Maybe they were forgiven and brought to heaven.
Oh no! Not paganism! Really, the only issue that God had was that people weren't worshiping him. That's all he really cared about. So he's essentially saying that these kids would have grown up not worshiping Yahweh, so it's just better for them to die now rather than lead a life of not worshiping Yahweh. And him giving God a license to kill just because God supposedly gives life is disgusting. I helped give my son life. Does that mean I have the right to off him whenever I choose? This kind of special pleading should be abhorrent to anyone that's listening to it. Oh, and his last-ditch effort there to soften the blow of genocide is just laughable. Maybe they were forgiven. Does he seriously think that the Israelites invaded the city and then spiritually cleansed all the women and children before stabbing them in their hearts? I sincerely doubt they did that. Just kind of seems like wishful thinking on his part, so he doesn't really have to combat with the idea that God commanded the genocide of an entire group of people.
The idea there would be that God cannot allow morally these kinds of things to exist. And again, I think that had God not brought forth judgment upon the Canaanites, maybe our atheist friends would turn around and say, well, why didn't God do anything? So God is holy. He is good. He is benevolent. He is loving, but he can't be loving if he's not just. And he can't be just if he's not loving. And therefore the actions were like a corporate capital punishment.
Well, considering that we've already shown that God doesn't really care about child sacrifices, he only really cares about whether or not people worship him, then that makes God commanding the genocide of multiple people groups, all because they didn't worship him. Sounds reasonable, right? Also, he's trying to tell me that God sat around for 400 years watching all these child sacrifices and bestiality taking place, and then just arbitrarily one day God gets up out of his lazy boy and is like, yep, all right, I guess that's enough of the child sacrificing and animal fucking. I guess we better kill everybody so it doesn't happen again. Yahweh problems require Yahweh solutions. And the only solution that Yahweh knows is the final solution.
But it's the idea of like, okay, well, yeah, the Canaanites obviously did a lot of bad things, and they did child sacrifice and like things like this. But let's still think of like Western culture. Like we like make a very common practice of abortion, which is something that we'd see as something similar to that. And like there's all kinds of other things like that are common in Western culture that are contrary to like Christian values in a sense. So like, wouldn't God then just be just in like wiping out like Western civilization? Like, would it open the door to like those kind of like possibilities then? So there's that kind of worry that I'm curious about, like what your response is to that, Ken.
While Zach sees abortion as being similar to child sacrifice, it's really not. For one thing, most abortions occur in the first 12 weeks of gestation. That means that most of these abortions are going to be chemical abortions. Chemical abortions are performed by taking a couple of pills that will block the production of a couple of hormones in your body. These hormones are necessary for fetal development. What this does is essentially force a miscarriage. These medicines would be similar to the bitter water that's administered to an unfaithful wife in Numbers 25:27. And when he has made her drink the water, then, if she has defiled herself and has broken faith with her husband, the water that brings the curse shall enter into her and cause bitter pain, and her womb shall swell, and her thigh shall fall away, and the woman shall become a curse among her people. If God cared about the unborn, like apologists always tell us, then he would not have prescribed to the priests that unfaithful women consume this abortion smoothie. This causes me to ask a couple questions. Questions like, is the real problem here the fact that we're not treating women who have had an abortion like shit? Or is the only problem here the fact that abortion services are available to all women and not just unfaithful ones? It seems to me that God at least approves of chemical abortions in certain circumstances.
Well, I do think it's reasonable to conclude, Zach, that if people adopt the position that you can have an abortion all the way up to birth, this is deeply concerning. I think it is infanticide at that point of view.
Later term abortions are normally done for medical reasons. Either the fetus won't survive birth, or the fetus is already dead. Or there is the situation of ectopic pregnancies that require a surgical abortion, but those fetuses are non-viable in the first place. Abortion services should remain available to people up until birth because these types of medical complications can occur at any point in a pregnancy. It's simply not infanticide. More to the point, even if it was infanticide, God most likely wouldn't really care about it. He is obviously fine with infanticide considering that he killed all the firstborn children of Egypt in order to free his chosen people. And then he also orders the senseless slaughter of infants and children in the cases of the Canaanites, the Midianites, and the Ammonites. God doesn't seem to give a shit about the unborn or infants.
And I think that what we recognize, however, from Scripture is that God, before he brings forth his judgment, he allows people an opportunity to repent, to stop, to change the course. But if they refuse, God's wrath will come forward. And I agree with you. I think there are some things in modern society that give me concern that maybe we're moving in a direction where we may earn the wrath of God. And
this is the point where the crazy religious person blames hurricanes, earthquakes, and other natural disasters on the gays and the fact that we let abortion run rampant in our society. I also like how providing healthcare to women seems to incur God's wrath. How pathetic can this God get? Oh shit, women can get healthcare and the gays aren't being stoned? This is preposterous! God's kind of starting to sound like a fucking incel.
Think of what C.S. Lewis said about Aslan. He said that Aslan was good, but he's not safe. I think a lot of times people think about God as if he's kind of a sleepy grandfather being. But remember that while God is benevolent, good, and loving, he's also completely holy and completely just. You know, if people came into my city and murdered and raped and pillaged, I would expect that a judge would hold those people accountable and punish them. So the idea that God does punish, that God does bring justice, seems to me consistent with my idea of goodness and love.
Sorry, I have a small public service announcement. The Israelites were the ones graping, pillaging, and invading! And they were doing it at the behest of God. Where's all this justice that he's talking about? I don't see any justice. Unless God flogs himself like that weird guy from the Da Vinci Code, I don't see any justice being done here.
Yeah, it's super helpful, and we're going to keep on moving on for the sake of time here. This next one kind of goes with the question of like Old Testament slavery. This is a common thing that's seen thrown out as like, well, the Bible endorses slavery or it allows for slavery, and like no perfect being would allow that. So what are your thoughts on like Old Testament slavery with like the goodness of Christianity, Ken?
Oh, here we go. Let me guess. He's probably going to deny that chattel slavery existed in Israel and is going to maintain that indentured servitude was the primary way that slavery was practiced.
Yeah, it's such an important question because we're living at a time where people are very sensitive about race, about ethnicities, and the question of slavery comes up. Zach, I would say a couple things. Number one, I would say that almost every culture in the ancient world practiced slavery. The Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, I can't name one ancient civilization that didn't practice slavery. So it's important to realize that maybe slavery is a human problem rather than a Jewish or Christian problem, or rather than pointing to Caucasians, for example. It seems that human beings have a problem with slavery. We have a tendency to oppress. We have a tendency to control, to use other people.
I do agree that slavery is a human issue, but the problem is that God issues laws specifically targeting slavery. Yet he fails to say that slavery isn't okay. And I know that a lot of apologists out there say that, well, God only issued those laws because man is horrible and his heart is hardened. But you gotta admit, God requests a lot of strange shit in his laws. How is it that God can request the very specifically weird ways to worship him as laid out in the Pentateuch, but yet he doesn't have time to say, oh, hey guys, you probably shouldn't own people? That could literally be a way to worship him by not owning another person regardless of where they come from. Apparently, he could mandate how people should fuck each other, but he didn't really care all that much about owning another person. It seems to me that God is perfectly fine with chattel slavery. The fact that Christians nowadays see slavery as abhorrent shows that they are far more moral than their own God.
Now, having said that, I don't think what is commonly known as slavery fits with what we find in the Old Testament. For example, in the Old Testament, I think you primarily have what we might call indentured servitude. That is, the indentured servitude of the Old Testament in large measure addressed the problem of poverty.
Indentured servitude was practiced in Israel, but chattel slavery was also practiced. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life. But you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Leviticus 25:44-46. The anti-slavery passages that you'll find in the Bible are really only discussing the topic of Hebrew slavery. That would be enslaving your fellow Israelite, and how that is forbidden. That is a totally different subject than what was mentioned in the Leviticus passages.
In the ancient world, there was no safety net. There was no welfare. There was no place to go if you couldn't pay your bills. And so you had a process where people would sell their livelihood. They would sell themselves to other people and work for them, and their needs would be met. But in this indentured servitude, people were not treated as if they were just mere property that you could beat them and you could kill them if you want.
Well, indentured servants were not treated that way, but chattel slaves were definitely treated like shit. Also, if you didn't know, fathers could sell their children into debt slavery. If a father owed money to somebody, he could instead trade the hard labor of his children in order to pay off that debt. So, kind of seems like God would be perfectly fine with forced child labor and human trafficking. Our God is an awesome God. Are we sure about that?
In fact, there are principles in the Old Testament because of the Mosaic law that says that masters have to be responsible for the people that are their workers or their bondservant. So I think it's a mistake to look at the antebellum slavery, the slavery of near the Civil War, and then to read that back into the Old Testament. I don't think it fits.
This part's just fucking hilarious because they literally use the Bible to inform the law surrounding slavery in the United States. It's insane to say that antebellum slavery was completely different when compared to Israelite chattel slavery. It's all chattel slavery. The Israelites got their chattel slaves from other nations. The U.S. slave owners got their slaves from other nations. The Israelites outlawed enslaving their fellow Israelite. In the United States, you didn't enslave white folks. The Israelites had indentured servants, and the U.S. didn't outlaw debt slavery until 1867. How can you say that these two systems were not similar?
In fact, one Old Testament scholar said there's only one law in the history of the ancient world that held masters accountable for the way they treated slaves, and that's the Mosaic Code. So you can say that, hey, why didn't God do something differently? But I would say God cares. In fact, here's a great quote. It comes from Houston Smith, who was a leading scholar of the world's religions. He contrasted the gods of Olympus, these are the Greco-Roman gods, with the god of Sinai, the god of the Old Testament. He said the gods of Mount Olympus, they're all about seducing the maidens. That's all they're after. But he said the God of Sinai, Yahweh, Jehovah, he's watching over the widows. He's watching over the orphans. He's watching over the aliens, the immigrants. He looks out for people who can't look out for themselves. And I remember, Zach, as a boy, I used to listen to Martin Luther King preach, the great civil rights leader. He was always quoting the Old Testament about God cares about people who lack power and lack food and lack money. Those are some of the things I try to bring up.
The laws surrounding slavery in Israel matched up with the standards that were commonly practiced in other nations. In some respects, the Mosaic Law was much harsher than the surrounding nations. So saying that the Mosaic Law was somehow better than all of the other nations at the time is a misrepresentation. Also, what evidence does he have to say that God cares about any of those groups of people? If he cared about immigrants, then God wouldn't have made it a law that you could take immigrants living in your own country and force them into slavery. If God cared about orphans and widows, then why would God specifically call for the murder of women and children? It seems to me that God doesn't really care so much for the people in general. He only cares about what these people can do for him, and that would be worship him, because that is ultimately what God cares about, whether or not you worship him. If you do, all is good. If you don't, you're fucked. Well, heathens, that's going to be it for me today. I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please go down below and leave me a comment. What did you think about Kenneth Samples' arguments here for genocide and slavery in the Bible? Do you think that genocide and slavery existed in the Bible as we know them to be? Or do you think that Kenneth didn't really do anything to support his arguments? Let me know down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.